Great. Well, I think we are ready then, and it is great to be able to introduce our keynote speaker for this morning. Jessica Hooten Wilson is the Fletcher Jones Chair of Great Books at Pepperdine University. She is the author of several award-winning books, most recently Flannery O'Connor's Why Do the Heathen Rage? A behind-the-scenes look at a work in progress. In 2019, she received the Hyatt Prize for Humanities from the Dallas Institute of Humanities and Culture. Other awards include a Fulbright Fellowship to Prague, an NEH study to study Dante in Florence, a Biola University Sabbatical Fellowship funded by the John Templeton Foundation, and the 2017 Emerging Public Intellectual Award. She's also a senior fellow at the Trinity Forum. But what I would like to mention about Dr. Hooten Wilson is my gratitude for the conversation we had just at lunch yesterday about the tradition and continuing conversation. It was a delight to sit with her and two of her students at Pepperdine, both of whom are incredibly impressive individuals in their own right, and to see the ways in which she invests in her students and engages constantly in that meaningful conversation with humility. So it was with great gratitude that I welcome her to the stage to invest in all of us.
After watching that concert, I am feeling very underdressed. They were lovely. So this morning, I actually want to begin the way that I begin my classes, which is in prayer. And so for those of you who don't pray, this is actually Dorothy L. Sayers' version of the Canto 11 from Purgatory, in which Dante rewrites our Lord's Prayer. So it is both a prayer or a meditation or poetry, whichever one you would prefer to think on as I read this as we begin. And I didn't bring all volumes of Purgatory with me, so I actually had my husband send me a picture of this, which is why it's on my phone. Our Father, dwelling in the heavens, no wise as circumscribed, but as the things above, thy first effects are dearest in thine eyes. Hallowed thy name be, and the power thereof by every creature. As right meet it is, we praise the tender effluence of thy love. Let come to us, let come thy kingdom's peace. If it come not, we've no power on our own to come to it, for all our subtleties. Like as with glad hosannas at thy throne, thine angels offer up their wills always, so let humans offer theirs, that thine will be done. Our daily manna give to us this day, without which the thought of this dear wild toils, most to speed go backward on our way. As with we, with all our debtors reconciled, so forgive us, nor regard our merits, but upon our sin please look mild. Put not our strength too easily ensnared and overcome to proof with the old foe, but save us from him, for he tries it hard. Amen. I want you to imagine with me that it is 1947, and you are at Oxford University, and it is summer vacation, and you are a teacher, and you are spending your vacation time trying to improve at the vocation that you love. And then who walks onto the stage? Is that the mystery novelist, Dorothy L. Sayers? As your jaw, you're picking it up from the carpet. What is she doing here? And then you think, why on earth is she going to teach me about teaching? You're not wrong. In fact, Dorothy L. Sayers hated teaching. She said, I'd rather sweep streets than teach children. But she was actually really good at it. Everyone who remembers her from the classroom said there was even one memory where she picked up a sword that was hanging above a mantle, and she grabbed it and brandished it among the students and began reciting the Pirates of Penzance. She was a very attractive personality even in the classroom. But on this occasion, she recognized with great humility and humor that she had very little right to be speaking to teachers about teaching. So she begins, "It will be pleasant to start with a proposition with which I feel confident all teachers cordially agree, and that is that they all work much too hard and have far too many things to do." Forgive my British accent. I lived in England for 2 years. So I'm just going to play because it's fun. "One has only to look at any school or examination syllabus to see that it is cluttered with a great variety of exhausting subjects, which they are called upon to teach, and the teaching of which sadly interferes with every thoughtful mind allowed to do their proper duties, such as distributing milk, supervising meals, taking cloakroom duty, weighing and measuring their pupils and keeping their eyes open for mumps and measles and chicken pox, and making out lists and escorting parties on field trips and filling forms and interviewing parents and devising those end-of-term reports that must combine the veneration of truth with a tender respect for feelings of all concerned." Okay, we don't have to reach very far to update Sayers. Right? I remember very well from my time teaching 4th grade at Covenant Classical School when I was called into lunch duty because my 4th graders were using Go-Gurts as squirt guns against the kindergartners. It's all the ways I thought I'd be using my college education. Sayers understands this tension between our aspiration to cultivate great hearts and minds, to love the good and the true and the beautiful, and the fact that sometimes those students are picking their nose while you're talking to them, or falling asleep on the desk, or telling you, "Well, I didn't read Hamlet because I saw the movie." By acknowledging this dissonance, Sayers won over her audience. And then she proceeded to ask the question that I think all of them were asking somehow in the back of their minds, but in the hectic hours of teaching had not been brought to the front. And she asks it for them. What if we're not really teaching the right things in the right way? That's the question that I want to pursue this morning. What if we're not really teaching the right things in the right way? And Sayers says, if we're going to produce the society of educated people fit to preserve intellectual freedom amid the complex pressures of modern society, we must turn back the wheel of progress 400 or 500 years to the point at which education began to lose sight of its true object. We must look to the Middle Ages. Now, if her audience in 1947 had not yet been floored, they were by this statement. The Middle Ages. I mean, we're in classical education now. We are familiar with her talk. Most of you know it by heart. You read The Lost Tools of Learning. It was republished in 1979, and by 1981, there were 3 classical schools in this country. So we know what she's talking about, but can you imagine going back to that time and hearing her talk about the Middle Ages as a way to understand how we might actually pursue teaching the right things in the right way towards our students' intellectual freedom? What could she have possibly meant? We know she didn't actually mean an educational program, right? She says, "I avoid talking about education as much as I do the plague." And when some Americans actually wrote her in 1950 and said, "Would you take your Lost Tools of Learning and turn it into a school curriculum for us?" she made fun of them. She said, "Like most Americans, they are full of goodwill but not knowledge." That's quite indicting. Are we the inheritors? Are we all full of a lot of goodwill but not knowledge? At the time, Sayers was writing to the director of the Department of Education at Oxford, M.L. Jacks. He had just written this great book called Total Education, A Plea for Synthesis. What he was actually talking about was this connection between the body and soul. And it was kind of revolutionary at the moment. There were not a lot of educators that were keeping the body and soul together when they thought about education. Now, those of us who are inheritors of reading You Are What You Love or anything by James K. Smith, we think about this philosophical anthropology that undergirds what we do. We think about the fact that these are embodied souls before us. They're not mere minds. There's something going on. And Sayers loved this book, but what she found as problematic was his dismissal of the Middle Ages. He said they had taken the body and soul apart. And she says, au contraire, the body and soul are very much united. What people sometimes miss, and what Dorothy Sayers didn't actually say to M.L. Jacks at the time, is that she was translating Dante's Divine Comedy. If we want to understand how the body and soul go together, how we can form our students towards intellectual freedom in such a way that we teach the right things in the right way, I think we have to look at what she was translating. I think we need to look at the Purgatorio for our example for what this formation might actually be in the classroom. Now, Sayers discovered Dante in her 50s. By this point, she was an acclaimed mystery novelist. She no longer was living in Mecklenburg Square discovering the joys of a frying pan, as she once wrote her mother, right? She had money. She had a name for herself. She'd written the BBC production, The Man Born to Be King. There was no reason to translate the Divine Comedy. I think that's important to keep in mind as we imagine what she is giving us witness of what education looks like. Because here she is in her 50s, and she's doing this useless, beautiful thing because she falls in love with it. In the 1940s, the Nazis are dropping bombs on London, and she grabs a book off her shelf to go hide into the air shelter in order to just read and entertain herself while bombs are literally falling. And what did she grab? The Divine Comedy. And she's reading it in Italian and discovering it for the first time. And she writes her friend Charles Williams, who was also an inkling and also a Dantisti, and she says, I was prepared to find a great poet, all capitals. I was prepared to find, of course, a great religious poet, and she even underlines all solemn capital letters. But I was not prepared to continually find myself saying, dear funny Dante. Do you hear that joy with which she approaches this material? Dear funny Dante. It's not a labor for her to translate this, so why does she do it? She does it for the sheer delight of it, for the discovery that she wants to pass on and share that joy with others. She's finding his poem not relevant just to the 14th century, but relevant to the 20th, and I think then relevant to the 21st. Many of her talks that were given around the same time as The Lost Tools of Learning were all Dante. It was all she was ever speaking on. She gives about a dozen talks on this because she understands what the poem actually insinuates from the very first line, di nostra vita, our life. She says, I saw that the whole layout of hell was something actual and contemporary, something that one can see by looking at oneself or into the pages of the newspaper. I saw a judgment of fact, unaffected by its time period, unaffected by literary or dogmatic origins, and I recognized at the same time that judgment was true. She found something that was good and beautiful and true. We recently entered hell last week in my classroom, and it was a fantastic opening. I have taught this poem I don't know how many times, 16, 17 times maybe in my life. And as we were entering it, I was struck by a new relativism and skepticism at a new level in my students. I'd heard some of these things before, but never with such vehemence. I had one student who was like, why are we reading this? I mean, these are, 18-year-olds, they sign up for my class. It is completely elective. They don't have to be there. So there are moments where I'm like, get out. Like, this is for kicks for me. I mean, this is fun. But at the same time, if I hold back my cynicism, I address the question. Well, why do you ask that? Well, isn't this just some guy who's angry he got exiled and he's just like putting everybody in hell? Fair, maybe. But what if, let's try this question. What if they want to be in hell? And the students just look at you. Who would want to be in hell? They're suffering, they're crying. Let's imagine this for a second. You have a cliff, you walk off the edge of it. What happens? Everyone, what happens? You fall, right? There's a law of gravity. Walk off a cliff. You are free to choose to do that. But there's this law of nature by which you will be succumb to the pain and torture of that fall. Or imagine this one. I have 4 children, so I think of these kind of illustrations. You can tell them not to eat all of their Halloween candy in one sitting. But if you have a 7-year-old like I do, she will sneak downstairs into the bathroom and lock the door and eat all of it until she's sick. The law of her body and the way it's designed, her freedom to choose that will have consequences for her. And so when I talk to students about hell, these are sinners who are free to constantly choose their sin, and they want to be there. They are suffering the consequences, and they still choose that route. That's what Dante is showing us in hell. It's not God being vindictive. It's not Dante being vindictive. It's maybe showing you something true about the human self. Now, some students can ascribe to that when they read Inferno, and there are some people that when they read Paradiso, that also makes sense, right? Let's look up to heaven and the transcendent things. I can understand the evil of my own soul. And then it's kind of like you get Good Friday and you can understand Easter Sunday. What do we do with Holy Saturday? What do we do with purgatory, right? That's right here in the middle. For those of you who only read Inferno, I would highly recommend you change your syllabus. Because just like Good Friday is not even a Good Friday without Easter Sunday. So Inferno makes absolutely no sense to me without the rest of the journey. And I think that when we look at Purgatorio, it's actually the one that has the most relation to us as educators than either of the 3 volumes. This one is the one that shows us what it looks like to learn. Now, when you're climbing this mountain, maybe you don't think of learning, but purgatory is that temporal process. It's the mountain by which it still has the seasons, it has the time, it's only going to last as long as this world. It ends in Eden, it ends at the very top, the starting point that we'll go over. And as you're climbing the entire time, Virgil tells the Cato at the start of the mountain, this is to win freedom. The whole journey is that intellectual freedom that is the goal at the end of this mountain. And Dante himself gives us permission to look at it this way. As you're reading through the story, he will say things like, reader, look behind the verses. Reader, don't be lost by metaphor. Understand what I'm saying spiritually. He literally takes off the veil for us several times throughout the poem. That veil is giving us permission to not only see ourselves in the poem, but be able to read it as an allegory for us and for the educational process. In what ways is it an education? Well, how many, show of hands real quick so that I know what I'm dealing with. How many of you have read Purgatory? Perfect. Okay, so as you are climbing Mount Purgatory, you're going through these realms of the different vices. And what's different from this world from the Inferno is in Inferno, you are suffering the consequences of your choices. In Purgatory, you are learning to love different choices. Do you see how key this is for education? In Purgatory, you're not suffering the consequences of your choices anymore. The things you're undergoing is teaching you to love something better. That's the whole point of education. You are trying to teach them to love what is worth loving, and that's the climb up Mount Purgatory. So when they enter, for example, the realm of pride, let's go with the first one. It's the very first realm that he gets to. Pride is the root of all sin. And as Dante enters this realm, he sees carved into stone these virtuous exemplars on the walls. And they're so beautiful and they're so lifelike. And he is just in awe I mean, it says that he approaches them to behold them more closely. He can't stop gazing at them. He can't stop turning his eyes to them. They seem so lifelike and so real. This art captivates him. There's two different educational lessons here. Both the art that moves him to turn his attention towards it. And the second is it's an exemplar of how he is supposed to be. The first one is Mary, and then it's David dancing before the ark, and then it's the Emperor Trajan, right? He's drawing from all these sources that are classical and Hebrew and Christian. Who are the virtuous exemplars that are going to begin his journey out of self-love and towards love of something greater? How many of us right now are uplifting virtuous exemplars of humility in the art we show our students, in the ways that we show them how to live? That's what they are going to want to witness to, is something that they see and know. It's models that they want and that they will desire. And then too often instead we are uplifting billboards of Kardashians, commercials with NFL players. I mean, if I ran the world, and nobody lets me, but if I ran the world, I would take down all of those billboards and I would paste up like posters of the virtues and the vices. It would be awesome, y'all. We'd have these like portraits of envy where there's like a snake coming out of her mouth and like chewing herself because it's like envy. It'll chew you alive, right? That's what we would have images of all around. To remind us not only of those virtuous exemplars, but just the same way we see in purgatory, what are the vices? What are the things that actually are destroying us from within? And Dante sees both of those. Also, in each realm, he undergoes kind of a training or an exercise. So, oh man, can I borrow your bag? Okay. Sorry, I needed a prop and I didn't think about it. So also, as he's like in the realm of pride, right? They each have these like burdens on their back and they're walking around and it is literally changing their whole form. They are a spiritual shade and they're undergoing this physical effort to look down now because they've been the ones. Their whole lives were chins held high, chest up. If you remember Inferno, this was like Farinata. These were the people that were proud of who they were. And now they're having to change their form because they are realizing their entire posture, their soul's posture, right? Get this, they are souls. In what way are our students' souls' postures learning to do this, or we're teaching them to do this? How are we training their souls? Dante walks with them with this burden on their backs, but not his. And he says, neck and neck, like oxen at the prow, I walked next to the burdened soul. He experiences their burden to retrain his soul. That's education. Education is an actual experience of something contrary. The whole world is misforming our students. Their choices are misforming them. A lot of the culture is misforming them. Media is misforming them. And you have this opportunity in front of you to reform them, to rehumanize them. And when you read this poem, that's what you're actually doing. Grab your students, get your backpacks on. We're going to discuss this by walking around. We're going to move our bodies into the positions that we want our souls to go, which is a lowering. Towards what? Towards intellectual freedom. But you actually have to experience it. You have to climb. You have to move up that mountain. As Dante experiences this, there's a liturgy that is along these lines for every single ring. And each time he hears voices come from somewhere that say, blessed are the, and then as he leaves, it's almost like woe to the. If you're familiar with the Gospel of Luke, Luke sets this out. Jesus actually preaches like, blessed are the poor in spirit, right? And woe to those who are proud. Blessed are the hungry and woe to those who are well fed. And this is the experience of that teaching in a formative way. It is one thing to say these things, right? It is one thing to teach the philosophy and understand the theory. Blessed are this, woe to this. It's another thing to experience it. We have to take the theories and the philosophy and the ways that we're teaching our students and move it into formative practices for them. For me, poetry is one of the best ways to do this. We see it happen in Dante. The Dante changes. If you remember him from Inferno, when he gets into the realms of Inferno, he's like the worst of sinners each time. He listens to the story of Paolo and Francesca, and he's like crying and faints and like, oh, wasn't their adultery wonderful, right? He's a complete sinner. That's our character, that's our pilgrim. But by the time he undergoes all these formative processes, by the time he's climbing up each realm, he becomes better and better and better. He becomes a better questioner. In Inferno, he's all like, ooh, how'd you get here? What'd you do, right? And he's always scared. I mean, my students actually get really frustrated reading Inferno because they're like, is he gonna cry one more time? Like, he just keeps crying and he's scared and like, he's all intrigued about their sin. And then as he climbs the mountain, it's like my students undergo this exact same process. They go from being intrigued by the sin and the darkness and the red and people are gnawing each other's heads and it's super cool. And then you get into Purgatorio and Dante's, his questions change. If the entire Divine Comedy is a great book seminar, which I think you could also argue, it's a dialogue of the dead. It's a dialogue of the dead that went from a metaphor to like a full experience. He's literally going through and learning how to ask the right questions. Whereas before he was intrigued by the things that brought him lower, right? This, you think about this in like a term of like Netflix, like streaming, right? What catches your eye? What's the clickbait? What's the flash? That's Inferno. And it's all descent. Now in Purgatorio, he's asking things like, hey, Marco the Lombard, I'm not going to ask about your life and what got you here. I want to know what's the cause of sin in the world. I'm no longer just going to look at the sin and be intrigued by it. I want to know, like, where does it come from? Is it the fault of the stars, right? Do we have any control over this? And of course, Marco answers in like one of my favorite lines in the Divine Comedy. The world is blind and you're obviously from there. It's a great line. But Dante draws this connection between this blindness and this enslavement to bad choices. If you want to look at the cause of sin, it's all about learning to see differently. It's about learning to imagine differently. He can only ask this question because of the experiences he's gone through up to this point. He can only learn to see and imagine better questions, better ways of responding that will eventually lead to his intellectual freedom because of the formative process he's going through. So what do these things mean from us? Well, let me kind of outline a few of them that I've said so far. Virtuous exemplars, cautionary stories, formative experiences, taking the theory and turning it into practice or poesis, teaching students to ask better questions, and learning how to imagine differently, how to see differently. Now, the only way you're going to actually be able to see differently is if you actually are experiencing imaginative things in the classroom, like Purgatory. This would be another one of my great books arguments. If you were reading things in which you only see yourself, how tautological is that? To just see what you already know how to see. You haven't expanded your vision. You haven't been challenged to have more eyes than your own. You're only going to see what you continually are able to see. Whereas if you read something like from the Middle Ages, Dante does not see the world the way that you see it. talk about stretching your vision. Talk about taking those motes out of your eyes and being able to open up your eyes, to lose that blindness, to lose the scales. That's what this does. And when we get to the very top of the journey, Dante receives the graduation, essentially. He gets up to the top, the scales are removed, and Virgil says, you're no longer blind. He says, no longer do you have to listen to me. I'm trying to, I don't think it's here in front of me because of course I just go, y'all. I just go. But it's something along this line, so those who know it by heart, let me know. But it's something along free, upright, whole. Your will is now free, upright, and whole. You no longer need a word from me, nor expect one, which is also kind of sad because it means Virgil's not going to be there anymore. But he says, Lord of yourself, I crown and mitre you. Your will is now free, upright, and whole. Lord of yourself, I crown and mitre you. Allegorically, he is now bishop and king of his own soul. He is now free. He can follow his own desires because they can guide him. Imagine that for a second. I don't know what age groups you teach. Are any of your students in a place where their desires can guide them freely? We live in a world that has confused liberty and license. And the problem with that is that we haven't given students the right loves and the right desires to aim towards. And that self-mastery will actually lead them there instead. That they will no longer be enslaved to their desires, but they will have free, upright, whole desires when you train them to. We are not oppressing them. We are trying to bring them to freedom through the formative journey of education. I was recently accused of being a colonialist, which is, all sorts of problems with that. I was in the middle of teaching Sappho, and I was like, I'm just struggling to see the connection between you calling me a colonialist and me teaching Sappho. But putting that aside, the reason this person said that was because she said, you're choosing for your students what they read. Yes, I am. I am choosing for them what to read because they don't know what I know. When did that become a bad thing to say? They don't know what I know. And as one of my friends who's a great classical educator, as she says, I am beholden to their 35-year-old self to choose better books for them right now. Because I want them when they're 35 to have free, upright, whole wills that they can choose the right things. But that means right now we get to choose for them. And it doesn't make us oppressive, and it doesn't make us colonialist, and it doesn't make us those who are standing above them in any negative way. I'm serving them. I'm literally saying, this is such a gift. This is such a gift that I'm giving you. And it's going to provide a way where, as a Virgil, I'm going to step back. And you're not going to have any more words from me. And you're going to get to a place where I get to say, Lord of yourself, I crown and mitre you. I am so proud. And like every graduation ceremony, it's also a commencement. It's a beginning. It's a starting point. Everyone who reads the Divine Comedy says, you've read the Divine Comedy, now you're ready to read the Divine Comedy. That's the whole point of it. This is a lifelong process. This is a lifelong journey that we are walking on with our students. And one of the beautiful things, this is the last thing, so I've said 6 things, this is my 7th thing about teaching from Purgatorio. One of the beautiful things about getting to be a teacher is walking alongside them. When you're with Virgil and Dante, that's what it is. I mean, yes, Dante says stuff like, sweet father and truthful father and my doctor and maestro, and he says all of these things. He reveres his teacher. He's listening to him. He's learning from him. But they are walking this journey together. That's so key. The day that I stop expecting my students to be teaching me too is the day I shouldn't be teaching them. And what you realize when you're listening to Virgil and Dante have these conversations is the humility with which Virgil will constantly say, I don't know, but maybe somebody else does. Usually he means Beatrice. But he'll say that. Here's the limits. Here's what I can do. I'm on this part of this journey with you. Here's where I can take you. Here's what I can do. That's a great question. I think those are the kinds of teachers that we all want to be. And I think sometimes it takes reading these stories to remind us of how much we want to be that we want to be Virgil and we want to be Dante. So what does this have to do with wonder and witnessing? I hope you've actually seen that. The best education, of course, is the one where you actually get to see the process versus me just explaining what wonder is or explaining what it means to live a certain life. When I originally titled this, I was in the middle of actually reading the Republic. I was teaching it with my students, and I was imagining, how Plato says that you're learning to love what is beautiful. All of these things go together all the time. But now I'm in the middle of Sayers, and now I'm in the middle of Dante, and I'm constantly on this journey of trying to understand how all these things go together, how they're all part of this beautiful whole. In the medieval mindset, wonder had two different meanings. You both wondered at the things that were right in front of you, right now. There was a way in which you would wonder at the eagle that you saw, or there was a way that you would wonder, right? You would, admiratio, you would admire those things. But then there was a higher wonder that when you read like St. Augustine or St. Bernard, they look up, and they think you can only admire the things that are mysterious and paradoxical. So St. Bernard is like, admiratio is for the incarnation, it's for Mary, it's for, right, these things that are above us. Or St. Augustine will say something like, you admire Perpetua and Felicity, right, because of their example as martyrs and their courage and their virtue. So you admire these things that are above you, you wonder at them. I think it's both. And one of the things that happens in Dante's poem that's so lovely is you're wondering at the poem that you're reading, and it's causing you to wonder about all the other things you don't know. It becomes this two-part, right? It's both literal and spiritual ways of reading at the same time. You're wondering at the thing that is here, and you're wondering at the things you don't know. And as you're doing this, you are learning that you too are on that journey, and it doesn't stop. That's what we witness in the life of Dorothy L. Sayers. To return full circle, for Sayers, she lived a life that just didn't stop wondering. She had never finalized all the answers about everything. She was very opinionated. She knew her mind. She knew certain things. And yet when she approaches Dante, it's dear, funny Dante. It's that friend that she wonders at, that she loves. It's his worldview that is strange and fantastical and exciting and invitational. The great medievalist Carolyn Caroline Walker Bynum, she says, everything that is not wonderful is false. When Dorothy L. Sayers is looking for what's true and finding it in Dante, she doesn't mean that she thinks hell is like that, and she doesn't mean that purgatory is like that. What she means is that what's wonderful there are all the things we just talked about. It's all the allegorical meaning of it that is just wonderful. And that's what she finds to be true, and that's what she finds to give intellectual freedom. So my great invitation to you today is hopefully you return to your classrooms and you're looking at those faces and they are full of wonder at what you bring before them, and you are full of wonder at them, and that your life is a witness and a testimony to that wonderful journey that we're on together, and that you don't stop, because it is the journey of our whole life. Thank you.